One frightfully hot morning, 9 years old, she awakened feeling very cross, and she became crosser still when she saw that the side by her bedside was not her Ayah. "Why did you come?" she said to the strange woman. "I will not let any mind of Ayah to me." The woman looked frightened, but she only stammered that the Ayah could not come. Mary threw herself into a passion and beat and kicked her. She looked only more frightened and repeated that it was for the Ayah to come to Missy Sahib. There was something mysterious in the air that morning. Nothing was in its regular order, and several of the native servants seemed missing, while those whom Mary longer hurried about with ashy and scared faces. But no one would tell her anything come. She was actually left alone as the morning went on, and at last she wandered and began to play by herself under a tree near the veranda. She pretended that she was in bed, and she stuck big scarlet hibiscus blossoms into little heaps of earth, all the time more angry and muttering to herself the things she would say, and the name of Sadie when she returned. Pig, pig, daughter of pigs. To call a native a pig is the worst insult of all. She cut her teeth and saying this over and over again when she heard her mother come out on the veranda with someone. She was a fair young woman, and they stood talking together in low voices. She knew the fair young man. She was with a fair young man. She married. Oh my goodness, I'm having troubles here. She was grinding her teeth and over and over again when she heard her mother come out on the veranda with someone. She was with a fair young stood talking together in low, strange voices. Mary knew the fair young man who looked. She had heard that he was a very young officer who had just come from England to check him, but she stared most at her mother. She always did this when to see her because the Mem Sahib, Mary used to call her that oftener than anything else, was such a slim, pretty person and wore such lovely clothes. Her hair was still curly silk, and she had a delicate little nose that which seemed to be disdaining, and she had large, laughing eyes. All her clothes were thin and floating, and Mary full of lace. They looked fuller of lace than ever this morning, but her eyes were not black. They were large and scared, and lifted imploringly to the fair boy's officer's face. "Is it so very bad? Oh, is it?" Mary heard her say, awfully, answered in a trembling voice. "Awfully, Mrs. Lennox. You ought to have gone to the hills 2 weeks ago." Sahib wrung her hands. "Oh, I thought I ought," she cried. "I only stayed to the dinner party. What a fool I was!" At that very moment, such a loud sound went up from the servants' quarters that she clutched the young man's arm, and Mary stood shivering. The wailing grew wider and wider. "What is it? What is it?" Mary asked. "Someone else has died," answered the boy officer. "You did not say it had been servants." "I did not know!" the Mem Sahib cried. "Come with me! Come with me!" She turned and ran into the house. After that, appalling things happened in the mysteriousness of the morning to Mary. The cholera had broken out in its most fatal form, and people were dying. The Ayah had been taken ill in the night, and it was because she had just died that the in the huts. Before the next day, 3 other servants were dead, and others had run away, and there was a panic on every side, and dying people in all the bungalows. During the confusion of the second day, Mary hid herself in the nursery and was forgotten by everyone. Nobody wanted her, and strange things happened of which she knew nothing. Mary often slept through the hours. She only knew that people were ill, and that she heard mysterious sounds. Once she crept into the dining room and found it empty, though a partly finished meal and chairs and plates looked as if they had been hastily pushed back when the diners rose suddenly. The child ate some fruit and biscuits, and being thirsty, she drank a glass of wine which stood nearly filled. It was sweet, and she did not know how strong. Very soon it made her intensely drowsy, and she went back to her nursery and thin again, frightened by cries she heard in the huts, and by the hurrying sounds of the wine made her so sleepy that she could scarcely keep her eyes open, and she lay down on her bed and knew for a long time. Many things happened during the hours in which she slept so heavily. She was not disturbed by the wails and the sounds of things being carried in and out of the bungalow. When she awakened, she lay and stared at the wall. The house was perfectly still. She had never known it silent before. She heard neither voices nor footsteps, and wondered if anybody had cholera and all the trouble was over. She wondered also who would give her now her Aya was dead. There would be a new Aya, and perhaps she would know some news. Mary had been rather tired of the old ones. She did not cry because the nurse. She was not an affectionate child and had never cared much for anyone. The noise and her wailing over the cholera had frightened her, and she had been angry because no one seemed to remember that she was. Everyone was too panic-stricken to think of a little girl when no one was fond of. The cholera, it seemed that they remembered nothing but themselves. But if everyone had got really, someone would remember and come to look for her. No, but no one came. By waiting, the house seemed to grow more and more silent. She heard something running, and when she looked down, she saw a little snake gliding along and watching her with eyes. She was not frightened, because he was a harmless little thing who would not hurt her. He seemed in a hurry to get out of the room. She slipped under the door as she watched him. "It is," she said. "It sounds as if there is no one in the bungalow but me and the snake." Almost the next minute she heard footsteps in the compound, and then on the veranda, footsteps, and men entering the bungalows and talked in low voices. No one went. No one went to meet or speak to them, and they seemed to open doors and look into rooms. "Desolation!" she heard one cry. "What that pretty woman was the child too. I saw there was a child, though no one ever saw her. I heard, but no one ever saw her." Mary was startled in the middle of the nursery when they opened the door, and the first few minutes later. She was a cross little thing and was frowning because she was beginning to be hungry and felt disgracefully neglected. The first man who went in was a large officer who had once seen who she had working to her father. He looked tired and troubled, but when he saw her, he almost jumped back. "Barney!" he cried out. "There is a child here. A child at least like this. Mercy on us! Who is she?" "I am Mary Lennox," the girl said stiffly. She thought the man was very rude to call her father's bunks like this. "I fell asleep when everyone had the cholera, and I have only just wakened up. Why does It is the child no one ever saw," exclaimed the man, turning to his companions. "She's surely been forgotten." "Why was I forgotten?" Mary said, stamping her foot. "Why does nobody—" The young man, whose name was Barney, looked at her very sadly. Mary even thought he his eyes as if to weep tears away. "Poor little kid," he said. "There's none." It was in that strange and sudden way that Mary found out that she had not a mother left, that they had died and been carried away in the night, and that the few native servants also had left the house as quickly as they could get out of it. None of them even remembers a Missy Sahib. That was why the place was so quiet. It was true that there was no one but herself and the little rustling snake. Chapter 2. Mistress Mary. Mary had liked to look at her mother from a distance, and she had thought her very pretty. She knew very little of her. She could scarcely have been expected to love her, or to miss her who was gone. She did not miss her at all, in fact, and she was a self-absorbed child, gave her entire thought to herself, as she had always done. If she had been older, she would have been very anxious at being left alone in the world, but she was very young, and she had always been. She supposed she always would be. What she thought was that she would like to know two nice people who would be polite to her and give her own way, as her other native servants had done. She knew that she was not going to stay at the English clergyman's where she was taken at first. She did not want to stay. The English clergyman, and he had 5 children, nearly all the same age, who wore shabby clothes, quarreling and snatching toys from each other. Mary hated their untidy bungalow and was so ill to them that after the first day or two nobody would play with her. By the second day they had given, which made her furious. It was Basil who thought of it. Basil was a little boy who had blue eyes and a turned-up nose, and Mary hated him. She was playing by herself just as she had been playing the day the cholera broke out. She was making heaps of earth in her garden, and Basil came and stood near her to watch her. Presently rested, and suddenly made a suggestion. "Why don't you put a heap of stones there as a rockery?" he said. "They're in the middle," and he leaned over her to point. "Go, boys!" cried Mary. "I don't want boys. Go away!" for a moment angry, and then he began to tease. He was always teasing his sisters. He danced round and round and sang and laughed. Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With cockle shells and marigolds all in a row. He sang it, and children heard and laughed too, and the crosser Mary got, the more they sang Mistress Mary quite contrary. After they at that, as long as she stayed with them, they called her Mistress Mary quite contrary. They spoke to her of her to each other, and often they spoke of her, and often when they spoke of her to her. "We're going to be sent home," Basil said to her, "and we're glad of it." "I am glad of it too," answered Mary. "Where is home?" "I know where home is," said Basil with a 7-year-old scorn. "It's yours. Our grandmamma lives there, and our sister Mabel had sent to her last year. You're to your grandmamma. You have none. You are going to your uncle, his uncle Craven." "I don't know anything about him," snapped Mary. "I know, sir. You don't know anything. Girls never do. I heard father and mother talking about him. He has a big, desolate old house in the country, and no one goes near him. He's so cross he won't let. They wouldn't come if he would let them. He's a hunchback, and he's horrid. I don't believe you." And she turned her back and stuck her fingers in her ears because she could not listen any more. But she thought over it a great deal afterward, and Mrs. Crawford told her that night that she was going to sail away to England in a few days to her uncle, Mr. Archibald Craven, who lived at Misselthwaite Manor. She looked so stubbornly uninterested that they did not know what to think about her. They tried to be kind, and only turned her face away when Mrs. Crawford attempted to kiss her, and held her son. Mr. Crawford patted her shoulder. "She's such a plain child," Mrs. Crawford told me afterward, "and her mother was such a pretty creature. She had a very pretty manner, too, and as good attractive ways I ever saw in a child. The children call her Mistress Mary quite contrary, and though it's naughty of them, one can't help understanding it. Perhaps if her had carried her pretty face and her pretty manners oftener into the nursery, and learned some pretty ways, too. It is very sad how the poor beautiful thing is gone, to remember that Mary never even knew she had a child at all." "I believe she scared looked at her," sighed Mrs. Crawford. "When her ayah was dead, there was no one to give a thought to thing. Think of the servants running away and leaving her all alone in that deserted bungalow." McGrew said he nearly jumped out of his skin when he opened the door and found herself in the middle of the room. Mary made the long voyage to England under the care of a wife who was taking her children to leave them in a boarding school. She was very much absorbed in her own little boy and girl, had to hand the child over to the woman Mr. Archibald Craven had sent to her in London. The woman was his housekeeper at Misselthwaite Manor, and her name was Mrs. Medlock. She was a stout woman, with very red cheeks and sharp black eyes. She wore a very purple dress, black silk mantle with jet fringe on it, and a black bonnet with purple velvet stuck up and trembled when she moved her head. Mary did not like her at all, but she very seldom liked people. There was nothing remarkable in that. Besides, it was evident Mrs. Medlock did not think much of her. Hi, Snockings. Snockings has decided to invade my lap. Hello. "My word, she's a plain little piece of goods," she said. "And we heard that she hasn't handed much of it down, has she, ma'am?" "Perhaps she will improve as she grows," the officer's wife said good-naturedly. "If she were not so sallow and had a nice and her features are rather good. Children alter so much." "She'll have to alter a good," answered Mrs. Medlock, "and there's nothing likely to improve children at Misselthwaite." The thought Mary was not listening. They thought because she was standing a little apart from them at the window of the private hotel they had gone to, passing buses and cabs and people. But she heard quite well and was made very curious on the place he lived in. What sort of place was it? And what would he be like? What was a hunchback? She had never seen one. Perhaps there were none in India, since she had been living in other people's houses and had had no ayah. She had begun to think queer thoughts which were new to her. She had begun to wonder why she had never sung to anyone, even when her father and mother had been alive. Other children seemed to belong to their mothers, but she had never seemed to really be anyone's little girl. She had had servant clothes, but no one had taken any notice of her. She did not know that Thid was a disagreeable child, but then, of course, she did not know she was disagreeable. She often thought other people were, but she did not know that she was so herself. Medlock, the most disagreeable person she had ever seen, with her common highly and her common fine bonnet. When the next day they set out on their journey to York, she walked through the station to the railway carriage with her head up and trying to keep as far away from her as she did not want to seem to belong to her. It would have made her very angry to imagine she was her little girl. But Mrs. Medlock was not in the least disturbed, and her thoughts. She was the kind of woman who would stand no nonsense from, at least that is what she would have said if she had been asked. She had not wondered just when her sister Maria's daughter was going to be married, but she had a comfortable place as, as housekeeper at Misselthwaite Manor, and the only way to keep it was to do at once what Mr. Archibald Craven told her to do. She never asked a question. Captain Lennox and his wife died of the cholera, Mr. Craven had said in her short, cold way. Captain Lennox and his wife's brother and her daughter's guardian. The child is to be brought here. You must go to London and bring her yourself. She packed her small trunk and made the journey. Mary sat in her corner of the railway, plain and fretful. She had nothing to read or to look at, and she had folded her thin hands in her lap. Her black dress made her look yellower than ever. Light hair straggled from under her black crape hat. Great-looking young one I never saw in my life. A more marred-looking young one in my life, Mrs. Medlock thought. Marred is a Yorkshire word which means spoiled and petted. She had never seen a child who sat so still without doing anything, and at last she was watching her and began to talk in a brisk, hard voice. I suppose I may well tell you something you are going to, she said. But do you know anything about your uncle? No, said Mary. Never heard your father and mother talk about them? No, said Mary, frowning. She frowned because she remembered her mother had never talked to her about anything in particular. Certainly they had never told her. Huh, muttered Mrs. Medlock, staring at her queer, unresponsive little face. She did not say any more for a few moments, and then she began again. I suppose you might as well think to prepare you. You are going to a queer place. Mary said nothing at all. Locke looked rather discomfited by her apparent indifference, but after taking a breath, not but that it's a grand place in a gloomy way. Craven's proud of it in his way, and that's gloomy enough too. The house is 600, and it's on the edge of the moor, and there's near 100 rooms in it, though most up and locked. And there's pictures and fine old furniture and things that's been in there for ages. Big park round it, and gardens and trees with branches trailing to the ground. Some of them. And took another breath. But there's nothing else, she ended suddenly. And to listen in spite of herself. It all sounded so unlike India, and anything new rather attracted her. But she did not look as if she was interested. That was one of her unhappy, disagreeable ways, so she sat still. Well, said Mrs. Medlock, what do you think of it? Nothing, she answered. Nothing about such places. That made Mrs. Medlock's laugh a short. Eh? She said. But you are like an old woman. Don't you care? It doesn't matter, care or not. You were right enough there, said Mrs. Medlock. It doesn't. What you're to be kept at Misselthwaite Manor for I don't know, unless